and welcome. You are listening to Mergers and Acquisitions, a multimedia blog and podcast series produced by the Society for Economic Anthropology. We'll be coming to you with a new collection of economic anthropology-related things to think about each quarter. Our first collection, produced by SEA member Anil Tripathy, focused on the contributions of economic anthropologists to the study of climate change. You can find those episodes by subscribing to the podcast on the Society for Economic Anthropology's website or by searching your preferred podcast service. My name is Cindy Eisenhower. This spring, I invite you to take a journey with me to explore the economic anthropology of discards. In a world with increased virgin resource scarcity, climate change, growing inequality, and the coming end of cheap nature, how might we come to rethink value? How might we reimagine value generation and critically interrogate dominant economic logics that at once tell us there is scarcity and simultaneously produce an abundance of waste? How might we understand the various people who, for a range of reasons and rationales, work to recover the value left behind by capitalist ruins? And how can we understand the various forms and practices of salvaging and circulating value, those that have been around as long as anyone can remember, and those that are just emerging in the cracks of a failing system? My guest this spring will help us to think through these questions and surely many others. Today, I am absolutely delighted to be joined by Dr. Elana Resnick. Elana is an assistant professor in the Department of Anthropology at the University of California, Santa Barbara. Her research interests include waste, materiality, critical environmental politics, labor, and racism. A great deal of Elana's work is based on long-term fieldwork in Bulgaria, conducted on city streets and landfills, executive offices, and at the Ministry of the Environment. She's currently working on a book that examines the juncture of material waste management and racialization, specifically highlighting how environmental sustainability projects become racial practice. Welcome, Elana. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much for having me.
I'm excited. I'm excited to chat some more.
Me too.
I want to start today with a really broad question, if I might. As you know, we're just getting this podcast series up and off the ground. So most of our listeners are probably economic anthropologists, but we really hope there will be many others. And that's part of the reason we chose the name Mergers and Acquisitions, to reflect the value of exchanging information and thinking together in new ways. So in that spirit, I'd love to ask you what economic anthropology is from your perspective, and in what way do you find it useful?
I think that's an excellent question, and I've been thinking on it for a while. I think economic anthropology has been very useful in thinking about value. And I've noticed that something often that anthropologists kind of go to when thinking about economic anthropology, who aren't economic anthropologists, will say, it's really important in value, because value is something that I think traverses so many realms of anthropology. Specifically for me, economic anthropology has been critical to how I think about labor. And labor brings in economic anthropology, political anthropology, and in my work also work about affect, about social hierarchy, social categorization, and race. And I think it's the intersections of these things, which include economic anthropology, that have been so fruitful.
Super, great point. That's wonderful. So you have done quite a lot of work on labor, and that's, for me personally, where I found a lot of really great insights from your work. And this is labor that's specifically associated with managing waste that's produced by contemporary economies. So helping our readers think through this, the material that's extracted, refined, manufactured, distributed, purchased, consumed, and then discarded before it becomes waste, and the responsibility of all of these waste workers and folks that salvage some of that value. Can you just talk for a minute about the study of waste and why it might be a really useful lens for people to think about economic life and contemporary economies?
So I think waste is a topic that moves beyond even sociocultural anthropology. I think that waste is in many ways a shifting term. And so that's what makes a lot of the work on waste, I think, so fascinating, is because our working definitions of waste continually shift and actually emerge from the sites in which we're working. Yeah. And in many ways, this also makes it difficult to create particular points of overlap. I have a lot of waste scholars. Sometimes we're talking about waste, but we're meaning different things. Mm-hmm. And so I think it's not a problem. I think it's actually the beauty of anthropology, and the beauty of the anthropology of waste is that the category of waste itself is emergent. So when we're studying, the questions we're asking are continually emerging from the field sites in which we are living, working, writing about. So I think that thinking about waste often is related to capitalist modes of economic life. And I don't think only waste, that waste always has to be associated with capitalist functions, because a lot of my work is actually about socialist era waste management. And so we can see that waste actually traverses a wide array of eras, of historical periods. But the work that I'm dealing with now looks at waste within a socialist and post-socialist capitalist economy. Mm-hmm. And waste and how it's managed is changing, because it's also categorized, recategorized, and politicized differently depending on the context in which it's emergent, it's being managed within, and thinking about the different economic systems that waste exists in. So within a planned socialist economy, waste was often looked at from the site of production. And that's something that a lot of contemporary green sustainability movements are trying to push towards, is that we can't just deal with waste at the site of consumption, right? We use a lot of stuff. What do we do with it? But that it needs to be baked into how items are produced for consumption. And the socialists, a lot of the planned socialist economies actually accounted for that, not because it was some environmental movement, but because that was how a planned economy works, right? You have to plan not just how things are produced, but what would happen to them in their afterlives.
Right. And about efficiency.
So I look at that change over time.
So how did you get into waste work? You've done quite a lot of long-term field work in Bulgaria. Was that something that you planned to do as you headed into the field, or was waste more of a secondary focus for you?
That's a great question. And I actually started field work during the summer of 2008. Bulgaria had joined the EU in 2007, and all of the kind of glorious NGO sector projects I was so excited about had seemed to die rather quickly.
Yeah.
And I became interested in what happens with EU accession, because in many ways, what I had expected and what a lot of the people that I interacted with expected was the opposite of what happened. There was a ton of disappointment, and EU accession meant that a lot of private donors like George Soros and some Western European donors pulled out of Romani initiatives in Bulgaria and in Eastern Europe, because it was now Europe's issue. And this was very problematic, because then funding had to go through national governments that have been kind of mired in white supremacy for decades. So that's really where the project picked up. No longer was there this public Romani activist space. It was, before EU accession, it was all over the news, public media. And then after EU accession, one of the primary spaces in which Roma were publicly visible was collecting waste on city streets. There was this huge shift. And I knew that there was more to Romani life in Bulgaria than waste work, but it was no longer as visible or vibrant as I had expected it to be.
Interesting. So that's actually provides a really good segue to something else I wanted to ask you about. So you've got this really great piece that I've used in classes before called Durable Remains, that's about the use of canning jars, glass canning jars. You talk about this in the context of EU free markets, right? And how EU recycling policy really doesn't account for the use of these types of glass containers. Can you just tell readers who haven't read that piece a little bit about it, your argument? And I think it's really fascinating I think it'd be really fascinating for the SEA membership, which has a lot of archaeologists as well to think about. This is from the Journal of Contemporary Archaeology.
Well, firstly, thank you for reading and assigning that piece.
Yeah.
That's one. I really love that piece, actually.
Students like it. It's accessible, and it's got a good kind of policy hook to it, so they really enjoy it.
That's awesome. That makes me so happy. I think the thing with writing is you feel like you're writing into a void. So thank you for teaching it and telling me that it's accessible to students. That's a huge goal. So the article is about glass, and I look at glass as having a wide range of affordances. So when we say glass, we might think it's fragile or it's breakable. And that was often something like when I was writing the piece, I was also talking to my undergrads, and I was like, what is glass? Because I really like to talk to them about materiality. And they're like, it breaks, and if you drop it, like it's gone, it shatters. And that was actually the very opposite of how glass was being interpreted and used in Bulgaria. So I was thinking a lot about what a materiality can afford. And in Bulgaria, what I had noticed, especially in Romani communities, was that glass was being used and discussed and analyzed for both its temporal endurance and its material durability. What does this mean? That glass doesn't break down, it doesn't compose over time, and people could reuse jars over and over and over again. They could heat them up and make preserves. And so the article is about how Romani communities in urban Bulgaria, because that's where I did my research, it was primarily an urban space, were reusing glass jars to jar tomatoes. And this isn't like a unique practice throughout the world. In Eastern Europe, people jar things, right? I mean, who knows? I grew up in a semi-urban space. I never learned how to jar, but people jar all over the world. But what was interesting about this wasn't the actual practice of jarring, but was what it allowed people to do and the kinds of belonging that it promoted. And a lot of my interlocutors would talk about how the durability of glass allowed them to jar tomatoes and create a kind of affective and sensory belonging in Sofia, Bulgaria in the winter, when people who have a lot more money with who aren't dealing with the economic hardship that so many Roma are, could buy jarred tomatoes. And a lot of the Roma communities I was working in would jar tomatoes themselves and had this whole annual cycle of jarring. And what I argue in the article is that it creates what I call material citizenship. So it's about people's sense of belonging, not through produced goods. It's different than consumer citizenship, but it's about the relationship with the substance of a material, which is glass. And the glass allows for this jarring, for the ability to eat sweet, juicy tomatoes in the winter when you might not be able to afford buying them prepackaged. And that creates a kind of belonging in urban space. And the second part of the article talks about how this reuse of jars that's so important, both within Roma communities and outside of Sofia in all communities. There's something particular, I think, about Roma in urban space jarring, but throughout the countryside, everybody is jarring. And the reuse of glass actually doesn't get taken into account when the EU considers how different items are recycled according to EU standards, because it's all about producing items, having them be recycled in a particular way, and reuse cannot be configured into that schema. So all of this labor and work and, real ecological innovation and conservation is not actually ever being noted by EU markers. And these EU markers are incredibly important for Bulgaria to remain in the European Union without sanctions.
That's so interesting. And it reminds me that, so much of the waste type labor that you and others have documented, it's highly invisible, right? I mean, it's somewhat hidden by dominant economic logics and policy, as you point out.
Yeah, I think that's one of the kind of driving factors of a lot of the work of scholars dealing with waste right now is there's a sense of waste, the people who discard it and never have to deal with it again. And then there's those who are dealing with the afterlives of capitalist accumulation and discard. all the time. And that's, I mean, in my field site and in my experience, it's highly racialized, it's gendered, it's class-based, but it's particularly racialized in the site that I'm working in. And I think it's racialized in a lot of sites around the world of who gets to just kind of throw things out and who has to clean it up.
Absolutely. Yeah, it plays into power relations 100%. So you've got this really great new article that I got to read a little early, but everybody can read it now. It's out Early View in American Anthropologist that talks a bit about this, about how waste work has become highly racialized. So the title of the article out now is The Limits of Resilience, Managing Waste in the Racialized Anthropocene. So can you just tell us what it's about? How has waste work become racialized?
I mean, this is another space in which we can look at economic change and political change over time, which in Bulgaria go hand in hand, because there is this very kind of distinct marker between socialism and, free market capitalism, 1989. And it's not that things from the past didn't kind of carry over and carry through, but these systems have, on paper at least, changed. And so the political economics of waste has changed over time. So in my research, Roma communities have always been dealing with waste, but it used to get paid during the socialist system with a wage that was not just a living wage, but was at sometimes on par with accountants at the waste companies. So this was not just, it was always work that white Bulgarians didn't want to do. It was stigmatized in particular ways as dirty work, but it was paid much, much better than it is now. Now it's a minimum wage job, which is not, at the time when I was working, that was €200 a month. And that's not at all an amount that anyone could live on in Bulgaria. So looking at kind of change over time, you see that the racialization of it is not just about who does the work, but how it's valued economically, but also politically and effectively. And when I mean effectively, like in terms of affect and the sense of what the work does, because during the socialist period, cleaning was esteemed as how we can kind of meet our Soviet standards of aesthetic urbanization. And so it was very much part of a socialist propaganda project. Okay. And it was much more visible in terms of public policy and the idea that these cleaners are cleaning for the nation. And this is a lot of socialist propaganda, but that shifted a lot in the post-socialist period, where the labor has been paid at a rate that's unlivable and the conditions have become much, much worse. So a lot of the sweepers that I worked with, most of whom are Romani women, will talk about they have stayed often in the same companies that were once state-owned companies and then switched to private. And they talk about what the conditions were like before versus now. And so that was a lot of the research I did. I worked on a street sweeping team for 11 months. And that's sort of the basis for a lot of my research and this article. And this article speaks to contemporary discussions of the Anthropocene. And something that really drove the article was reading, when I came back from fieldwork, about this idea of naturalized resilience. And, that there's these communities that can be resilient to the capitalist forces of anthropogenic accumulation. And I was like, this, and along with other scholars that I'm citing in the book, thinking about resilience, Amy Cox and Elizabeth Roberts, are also critiquing this idea of resilience because it's so passive. And a lot of the workers I was sweeping with were really actively managing not just the waste that they were dealing with in a very physical labor way, but they were dealing and managing with this continued racialization, white supremacy, and violence that they were dealing with on the streets. And so that was really sort of the driving force behind the article. And the article develops the idea of anthropogenic management as a set of strategies that people use. They're active strategies to deal with increased waste accumulation. And what it does is it bridges different levels of scale, the immense planetary scale of the Anthropocene, as we often talk about it as scholars, and the racialized daily practices of sweeping streets. And it pushes past, I'm trying to kind of push past this resiliency paradigm in this, which is focused a lot on individual ability, to talk about the systemic and institutional effects of what commonly is called the Anthropocene, which is inevitably always a racial Anthropocene.
Mm-hmm. So I want to ask a question. I realize I'm asking you to speculate, which is totally unfair. But knowing what you know about the communities with whom you've worked and about just kind of the contemporary capitalist moment, what do you foresee as a future for the Romani waste workers with whom you've worked? There's been a lot of discussion about as discards become more valuable with the coming end of cheap nature, that they might be increasingly commodified, and it will be actually exclude people in informal sectors. What do you think? Do you see a positive future? Do you see opportunities for integration in a way that provides real livelihoods and a livable wage, or do you have a more pessimistic view?
I like this question. It makes me think in new directions. Well, I think what the stakes of my work is ironically not about, the capitalist accumulations that we often think about that people are dealing with, right? They're dirty, they're dehumanizing. And really what emerged from my fieldwork was how creatively generative workers can be, and not just to create economic value from trash. It's not just this kind of out of the trash is treasure kind of thing, but that they're creating and redefining a new sense of what politics is. So what I saw was people that were dealing with waste within this very kind of complicated landscape of diminishing political, as we might see it in the government representation. EU accession for most Roma has meant actually diminished representation in official institutional government systems, and an NGO sector that has been taken over by those white supremacist governments. And so what we see is people finding political avenues in the spaces that they have. And so the book that I'm writing now, based on this research, is really about the politics of refusal that women engage in the spaces of waste labor, creating this, it's not a trope of joy and, from pain or anything like that, but it's about this idea that they're having to live and do the labor of so-called progressive environmental sustainability initiatives, right? Because to create a clean, recycled landscape, or a recyclable landscape where things are recycled, and and they always talk, it's going to look like Germany, right? That's the goal of all of this EU accession stuff. You have these women that are like, really the backbone and heart of that labor, and that labor is this very progressive labor that actually relies on. It's a progressive project, right? In name, but it doesn't take into account the racialization that it actually entails. Mm-hmm. And so in the midst of that kind of nexus, you have these Romani women that just were, inspiring for what they could create in terms of a refusal of a status quo. And I kept kind of playing with the idea of what does it mean to be sustainable? And they were also playing with that idea. Like, we're the workers of sustainability. What are we really sustaining? Our own racialized status quo, and trying to push and pull with that and play with that. And there was a lot of creative play. So I see things more in those terms. Looking forward, I have a lot of hope. I think Romani women are the future. They're doing this amazing work, not just the labor of waste management that is important on an institutional level, but creating pockets of political refusal and political generative work that is not often recognized by the state, and importantly so.
Alana, I wonder if you would be willing or able to give us a quick kind of example of that type of refusal, just to help our readers our listeners, I suppose, in this context, to be able to root that into a real idea.
So I have, right now, I'm writing the book. So I'm in the midst of this, and I have some chapters that are talking about the humor that these women use to kind of play with their visibility. There's this play between visibility and invisibility on public streets. And I see that as in many ways a deeper and more expansive kind of politics. You're wearing this uniform, and in many ways you're in day glow colors, right? Whether it be yellow or orange or red. And there's this constant hyper visibility play that people are doing. And I talk a lot about that. What does it mean to then, on the space of the street, start catcalling white Bulgarian men? And what does it mean to be, in some ways stigmatized by the labor, and yet push through and say, I'm gonna make myself even more visible in public space. And so I have a chapter that deals with that talks about the kind of intimacies that are forged through waste labor and what that pushes against in terms of not just social norms, but in some ways actually creates new ideas of what the future could be. And then I also have some work on water, which in the space of Romani neighborhoods can often serve as an antidote to waste. So what does it mean to clean yourself of waste after the long day of work? And so I look at how different Romani communities are accessing water outside of state structures. And it's both about certain kinds of material repair, meaning the actual fixing and using of pipes and creating these social solidarity networks to access things that the state wouldn't give, but also about this humor that, and a lot of this is really about these affective relationships between people. It's about social solidarity, friendship, and humor to reject and refuse a state that doesn't provide infrastructural needs of these communities that are dealing with waste all day. You come home, the state doesn't give you running water, right? In a downtown's, urban capital where you're literally walking distance to like 3 Starbucks. Right. So I'm in the midst of parsing out these different kinds of, it's a refusal to die. It's a refusal to give in to the system. And it's also it's creative, both in terms of creating social relationships, but at times also creating different kinds of material relationships, right? Repairing and working through pipes and these very intricate social networks that have to emerge to compensate for what the government and the municipality lacks.
Super. Elana, that was so fun. It's so fun to learn more about your work, and nice to meet you. I've been following your work for a while, but never had a chance to meet you. So
it's really nice to meet you too. Hopefully we can one day meet in person.